Right, hello everyone, and welcome to the ESET Africa StorageCraft webinar. We're going to get started now. There isn't a lot of people online, but we're going to get started anyway, and obviously people can join as they come along. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone quickly. So hopefully you have this up in front of you at the moment. So I know that some of the attendees have attended our StorageCraft webinar before, so I hope that I can maybe add a few bits of useful information that you haven't necessarily seen before. First and foremost, obviously, for those that haven't joined us before, StorageCraft is our backup and disaster recovery solution. We mainly brought it on, obviously, as a result of many of the other industry players, such as Symantec and a couple of other companies, having a backup and disaster recovery solution as part of their portfolio. And we decided on StorageCraft, obviously, as a best-of-breed solution in order to offer that product to our partners. So first thing that I want to discuss with everyone is, obviously, why would one or why do you need a backup and disaster recovery solution, right? So these are mostly statistics that we were able to obtain from the United States, obviously, because that's the information that's most readily available. And as you can see from the graph that I've got in front of you is the most prevalent reasons for data loss are hardware failure and human error. So unfortunately, hardware failing and people making mistakes even today are still the most relevant reasons or most frequent reasons for people experiencing data loss. Then we've got software corruption and theft next in line with 13% and 99% respectively. And then the most uncommon, surprisingly, is viruses and destruction through other causes. Now, obviously, with ransomware becoming a more common problem, we do expect these numbers to change somewhat because obviously ransomware is considered the most prevalent threat online today. But it still only accounts for a very, very small percentage of the reasons for data loss. Next, I want to discuss a few common mistakes that are made when people typically implement some kind of backup and DR solution. First and foremost is obviously not checking or verifying your backups. This is obviously paramount to ensure that you can actually recover following a disaster, and there's nothing worse than trying to recover from corrupt or incomplete backups. So having been in that position myself at previous places of employment, and I'm sure as anyone that's listening and anyone that has joined us have probably encountered before, it's probably one of the most embarrassing situations to deal with when dealing with a customer is telling them that you've been doing their backups all along, but they aren't currently working and you can't actually recover their data. Second, backup drives or destinations running out of space. So this is obviously an easily avoidable problem, which can also lead to embarrassment on the part of the provider or the MSP if that's something that they're responsible for. So that's really something easy that one should cater for. And then third, obviously with some competing solutions, particularly those that are file and folder based as opposed to volume based, or particularly those that are backup solutions as opposed to DR solutions. Often they'll encounter problems where they can't back up certain files because they are locked in a particular application or in some other type of software. Fourth, the exclusion of files or folders that can potentially exclude vital information. So the idea there is with a volume-based solution, which is what we offer, as opposed to a backup schedule where you just select certain files or folders. Obviously, if you're selecting certain files or folders, you may run into the problem where someone deleted something accidentally, or there was a hardware failure, or something like that, and now you're sitting with a problem because you simply didn't cater for that data and it wasn't actually backed up. Next, the old adage of putting all your eggs in one basket. Obviously, there's all sorts of things like theft or fire or floods or lightning, or all sorts of things that can destroy your data and backups if they're all stored in one place. So it's a very good idea to set up some form of replication, whether that be using legacy methods and manually taking tapes or other backup drives off site, or by utilizing a WAN-based replication mechanism, which our solution is capable of, it's obviously a great idea to not store all of your data in one place. And then lastly, no proper backup schedule. Obviously, accidents really happen on timely schedules, so it's a good idea to plan for the worst and always be prepared. And it kind of goes hand in hand with that is that when you configure your backup schedule, that you accurately identify how often you need to back up the systems in question. What type of data do they have? How critical is it to your business? And what is the maximum period of time that you can accept losing data? So that obviously influences how frequently you set your backup schedule. So you could have something where critical server is constantly being worked on, and as a result, you may say that you need that backed up, say, once every 15 minutes. Whereas with a solution that doesn't have a lot of data that's constantly changing, it might be more worthwhile to maybe back it up once an hour or once a day or something like that. So it's very important to ensure that your backup schedule is properly defined. Next, why would you want to sell a DR solution, right? So the first point there is that backup and disaster recovery as a service is an easy way of generating additional recurring revenue, right? So for break and fix customers, as well as customers that you provide professional services for, obviously you providing something like a data protection service means that you've got some natural and easy way to expand your relationship with a customer into one that provides you recurring revenue. So obviously, if you're providing backup and DR as a service, you're providing that service on an ongoing basis to a customer. So you're always certain that you're going to keep generating revenue with that particular customer. And as they grow, so does your billing to them, because if they need to back up more data and they already use you, obviously that's going to mean more additional and recurring revenue. Next, you can garner customer satisfaction and retention through providing indispensable services. So when you're protecting your customer's data, you've obviously become some type of indispensable partner or vendor to their business. So hiring a new organization or vendor is quite easy, but moving your data to a new service provider isn't. So obviously, if you get a customer that finally gets some type of data protection solution in place, and it works well for them and meets their recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives, then that obviously means that they're not going to want to leave you. Next, you can involve your customer relationships. So obviously, if you're selling some type of strategic service like data protection and disaster recovery, it allows you to completely change your relationship with the customer from being another vendor selling hardware or software to being his, let's call it a virtual chief information officer. So it means that you are able to make strategic recommendations and deliver critical business systems for them. So obviously you're providing much more than just DR as a service. It also means you can provide other sets of infrastructure like hosted mail solutions or on-site technical support or training and everything else as well. Then obviously you get to experience continuous growth. So obviously one of the beauties of any service that's tied to data is that it typically grows at a minimum of about 20% every single year, which means that if you've got an existing set of customers purely based on the continuous growth of their data, you can typically experience growth of 20% even if you don't add any new customers. So that's why it's obviously important to create a business model that's able to capture that constant growth. And then lastly, you can leverage existing infrastructure. So obviously, if you've gone and made the investment in infrastructure, then you can leverage that investment by pointing more of your customers' data to that environment. And if you haven't necessarily made that investment and you don't want to, then you can point the customer data to your service provider partner and then let them provide the hardware, software, and obviously the operations behind it, while you focus your energy on providing the professional services and engaging with your customers and partners and obviously generating sales as a result. So how do we approach all of this and how do we do this? The solution is obviously StorageCraft. So StorageCraft is a volume-based backup and recovery solution. So as I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, it's a bad idea to rely on file and folder backup. So it means that an entire partition is backed up. You don't get to choose what you want to back up and what you don't. You back up everything. And then more importantly, it focuses on recoverability versus just a backup, right? So the entire StorageCraft solution has been built from the ground up to ensure business continuity. So it means that no matter what happens, no matter what type of disaster you experience, that you will always have the facilities available to recover from following from a disaster. And there's a number of ways in which they achieve that, and we'll get to that as we go along. So just to note a few key features, obviously there's encryption available for the backup images that are created by the system, and there's a number of encryption options available. There's RC4 at 128-bit, and then there's also AES 128 and 256-bit for the more security conscious among us. It's also a cross-platform solution, so it supports Windows and Linux clients. There's also replication to local and cloud infrastructure available. So while speaking about that point, it's important to note that local replication is always free, but depending on the WAN or internet-based replication mechanism that you use, there may be job license costs involved. So obviously later on you can send us any questions. While we're at that point, please feel free to send through any questions in the Q&A section on the WebEx platform, and we'll answer those questions towards the end of the session. And you can obviously also get in touch with anyone in our sales department in order to get more information on licensing costs. In terms of the replication, though, aside from the local options, there's a number of cloud options or network-based options, and we'll actually cover that a bit later on as well. Next, you can obviously boot VMs from your backup images, and that is done through something that they call virtual boot. And virtual boot basically serves two purposes. The first and foremost is verifying your backups. Obviously, as I mentioned, the whole solution is catered around ensuring that you can actually recover, and one of the ways that you can ensure that is by consistently testing your backups on a regular basis. So by booting a backup image into a virtual machine, it means that you can obviously ensure that the operating system is booting correctly, that all of your production data and applications are working correctly, and you can basically tick that off as a completely functional and working backup. The second way that you can leverage the virtual boot functionality is by using it as a temporary failover machine. Because you can take a machine that's maybe gone down or something that's going to take a bit longer than anticipated to fix for whatever reason. Maybe it was a physical machine and you need to source new hardware for it, or whatever the case may be. So you can start that machine up as a VM, reconfigure the network interface, and effectively make it available in a temporary state. When you then shut that down, you have the option of either keeping the changes that you've made on the machine, so obviously any data that has changed while that machine has been running, or if you simply want to discard those changes. And obviously, if you're discarding the changes, it means that you were just using it to test the backup. Then there's central management of backups and policies. So there's a component called shadow control, which we will show you a bit later on. And that's basically responsible for managing the backups and policies, not for just one organization, but actually for all of your clients in one place. So there's a single web-based interface that you use to manage the backup requirements and the alerting and the reports and everything else, all from one basic web interface. Then there's also the ability to restore to dissimilar hardware, and that's done through a component that they call Head Start Restore. And the idea there is it basically pre-stages your backup images to make it readily available following a disaster. So you can almost think of it as a kind of standby for a particular machine. It means that you've taken all of the backup images and they've been compiled in a functional disk file or onto a physical drive that you can then use to immediately start up a new machine. So as a result, you can also do it, use it for various types of migrations. So you can do physical to virtual, virtual to physical, physical to physical, and so on. So one of the ways that that functionality is used is, let's say, for example, I've got a big Dell server in my environment. That server dies, and for some reason I can't get another Dell server. And then obviously if it was, as an easy example, a Windows machine, it's fairly likely that if you, say, take that data and try and load it up on, say, a super micro server, that will actually blue screen because of drivers and other bits of configuration that's obviously not there. So as part of the Head Start Restore functionality, you have the ability to inject the relevant drivers into the system, and as a result, you'll be able to migrate it off to various different platforms. Then, of course, there's the ability to verify the backups. So obviously, I've mentioned the virtual boot so that you can test them. There's also a component called Image Manager. And Image Manager is responsible for the consistent and ongoing verification of your backups. It's also responsible for the replication if you use it. It's also responsible for the Head Start Restore functionality. So the verifying of the backups is basically done using an MD5 hash file. So every single backup image that's created, there's an MD5 hash file that's created alongside it. So it checks the hash and makes sure that the data image itself sitting at rest is not corrupt in any way. But that doesn't obviously ensure that the data inside that backup image isn't necessarily affected in some negative fashion. And that's where you use the functionality like virtual boot, or doing something like a test restore, where you just mount the backup image and you actually copy some files or critical folders out of the backup images to somewhere else on your environment, and then verify that that data is in fact intact. Then there's also white labeling of the reports functionality. Now that's particular to the Shadow Control Central Management System. It basically means that when you configure Shadow Control for a particular customer, you can specify some addresses, maybe a CEO or the head of IT or the on-site IT department or IT guy, and you can basically have those reports delivered to that person or those people, say daily or weekly or so on. And it means that you can basically prove that you are meeting any SLA or service level agreement that you have with that customer. It's also nice because you can obviously input your own logo and everything else, and so when those reports or those alerts go out to your customer, it's representative of you and your organization. There's also granular recovery for Exchange. So that's basically an optional add-on that's available. So there are a few prerequisites. Firstly, you either need an existing Shadow Protect server license. Shadow Protect is the backup agent as part of the StorageCraft solution, or you need any other backup and DR solution which is currently backing up your Exchange database file, because the granular recovery for Exchange basically mounts that Exchange database file from whatever backup image, and then basically provides you with an Explorer style interface where you can literally drag and drop items out of the backup straight into your production Exchange server. So obviously that's a great thing, ensuring that if anyone maybe deletes something or had deleted something some time ago and need to get it back, you can go back to those backup images, mount the Exchange database, and then find the deleted entry and then restore it straight to that user's mailbox, for example. In terms of pricing, it obviously fits medium to enterprise customers primarily, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we've forgotten about the smaller organizations. There are a range of small business bundles available where it, for example, bundles, say, a server license and a handful of workstation or desktop licenses in order to ensure that you can get up and going quite easily. And it also comes at a slightly reduced rate as opposed to buying those items individually. There are also monthly billing options available, so there is an MSP program. Just a caveat around that is that there is a minimum monthly commitment of 1,000 Rand. Obviously, I'm speaking in South African currency. I'm not sure what that translates to in dollar, depending on the current exchange rate. But again, you can check on that with your salespeople. But basically what that means is once you meet that minimum monthly commitment, you can actually pay for your licenses on a monthly basis. So it means that you can scale up or down with your customers. So you don't necessarily need to try and gather lots of sales, because you've got small monthly amounts that are constantly being billed, and obviously that's how you can easily build a recurring revenue model as well. Next, of course, it's billed per system, not per gig, right? Because it's a volume-based solution, you are sitting with a solution that backs up an entire volume or an entire partition. So we don't care how much data you are storing. That's obviously up to you to ensure that you've got the appropriate storage infrastructure in place. I see that one of my colleagues was kind enough to quickly send me the value. It is $70. $70 US is the minimum monthly commitment for the MSP program. Next, of course, are major competitors. Obviously, the easiest and most prevalent of which tends to be Symantec's Backup Exec. Obviously, as a competing antivirus vendor, they've got their own backup and DR solution. And then there's Acronis, which is also extremely popular. There's also Veeam. Veeam is only available for virtualized infrastructure, but it does that very well, of course. But it might be ideal to instead, especially if you've got a mixed environment, it's obviously far more efficient to have one solution than having to manage two completely separate solutions and maybe train up all of your people in order to cater for that. And then there's also Unitrends coming in at the bottom there. So I just want to show everyone a quick diagram just to show how a typical StorageCraft deployment would look like. So what you're looking at the moment, let's say this is client A, for example, and you can say that there's another environment that looks similar, it's client B, client C, and so on. So this would typically represent their network, and maybe they've got a couple of servers. Each of those servers maybe run one or more virtual machines. You've got a couple of workstations, maybe a couple of laptops, and whatever other devices you've got. Everything's connected through some type of central network infrastructure, whether that's a network of distributed switches or routers or just one big one, obviously doesn't matter. This is just for simplicity's sake. But the more important thing that you need to take away from here is the StorageCraft backup agent, which is shadow control. That can be represented by each of these little circular icons with the shield inside. So that basically just indicates where you would need to install the backup agents. So in the case of virtualized infrastructure, you wouldn't just install it on the actual physical hosts. You would install it inside each virtual machine as well. And the reason for that is obviously that way you get detailed incremental backups that are being generated within each virtual machine for any data that has been changing, and obviously that means that recovery of those virtual machines is extremely seamless, where you can go back to a previous point quite easily. Then the other important point here is having some type of centralized storage. So that's represented in my diagram by the NAS in the bottom left. So that can be anything. It can be a shared external drive. It can be a network attached storage device. It can be a SAT. It can be anything. The main point is that you want some highly available location where you've got adequate storage to meet all of the requirements for your backups. Next, you will have a BDR device. It's obviously a backup and disaster recovery device. And that can actually be anything. It can be a VM running on your environment. It can be a physical server. It can be a spare workstation or laptop. It doesn't really matter. The main point is that you have to have some machine that is dedicated to run an instance of the StorageCraft Image Manager software. Because obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Image Manager is responsible for the ongoing verification of your backups, as well as the replication, as well as the head start restore. So you want something that's running constantly in the background so that it can immediately verify any new backup images as they are created, and obviously replicate any new images over to the remote location in case anything has changed. Next, of course, I just want to point out the little red line running from the router over to the internet, and that's just indicative of an outbound internet connection. And the reason that it's in this diagram is because this is just to illustrate where you would have an instance of something like shadow control. So obviously shadow control, I mentioned, is the central management system for your backups and policies and organizations. And the idea is that all of the agents and the little bits of software running in, say, client A or client B and client C and so on, all report back to one instance of shadow control, which you then use to monitor and manage everything. Next, you can also have your own replication servers. So that comes in the form of either ShadowStream or IFTP or Intelligent FTP. Now, they basically do exactly the same thing, but they are suited or intended for users or organizations with different grades of internet connectivity. So ShadowStream is optimized for environments with high latency and low bandwidth. So someone with the likes of an ADSL connection or something similar. And the reason for that is obviously what it does is it takes a backup image, let's say it's a 100 gig initial full backup image. And obviously it takes it and it chops it into tiny little pieces, and then it uses multiple connections and streams to send that data over to the replication server. And then the ShadowStream server component is responsible for reassembling those bits into a complete backup image. Whereas IFTP, because it's got FTP in the name, obviously uses file transfer protocol. And as I'm sure many of you may have encountered, if you've had a large FTP transfer that was interrupted somewhere along the lines, most of the time it has to start from the very beginning again. So obviously it would be really inefficient if you're sitting with a 100 gig file. If it fails at, say, 99 gigs, then you have to re-upload absolutely everything from scratch. And that's why the Intelligent FTP option is primarily intended for environments with low latency and high bandwidth. So someone with a fiber connection or a microwave or point-to-point wireless link or something like that, basically just a high grade of internet connectivity. And the idea here is obviously that you then, as the MSP or as a provider, become the target for the replicated data. So you've got client A, client B, client C, and all of the machines on their respective networks are pushing data to your replication servers that you then control. So you then obviously also provide replication services and everything that goes along with it. Next, we're going to jump into a short demo of the product. So give me just one moment while I switch to a couple of different screens, just hold on a couple of seconds. Obviously, while I'm doing this, just to remind everyone that please feel free to send through any questions using the Q&A section in WebEx, and obviously we'll answer those questions towards the end of the session. I'll be with everyone in just a second, just to have a few other windows that I need to ensure are available for this. Right, there we go. Okay, so what everyone should see in front of them at the moment, this is the Shadow Protect SPX Backup Management Console. So this is the backup agent software that you would have running on every machine. So what you can see at the moment is just a couple of things that I want to highlight. Obviously, there's our current backup job that I've got in place on this machine. We've got a few details as to whether or not the last backup was successful. We can see the job summary. Now, the one thing I want to point out here is that you can see that it is a shadow control policy. So this is a backup policy that I have implemented through the shadow control management system. And the important thing that you need to take away from this is it's extremely useful for you as the managed service provider to use shadow control to manage the backup environment for your customers, because it means that you can effectively ensure that no one can tamper with your backups. So I can take this backup image, I can try and edit it, I can try and delete it, I can do whatever I want, but I can't actually tamper with this backup because it has been implemented through shadow control, and that's where you need to manage it. So this will ensure that even if the users are, say, local administrators, that they can't tamper with those backup images. And now we actually see it just started running. That's because this is running once every 15 minutes. And that's obviously now running the appropriate backup. Next, you can also see a few details for this backup. We can see when it was last run. We can see how much total disk space is being used by all of the backup images combined. We've also got a bit of a job timeline over here. So I can obviously, I can scroll back and I can actually view the backup status for previous events that have occurred. And each of these little green lines basically signifies a successful backup that has been completed. Obviously, it will also be highlighted with different status codes, and incidentally, the length of the line is representative of the size of that backup. So the longer the line, the more data it is actually backed up. So you can see that this last incremental backup that was done, it was only 15 minutes ago that the last one was done, and only 1.7 megabytes worth of data has changed on the server of mine. So that's how the incremental backups are obviously incredibly small. And there's a few things that you can do from here. I can obviously go and view details around that image. I can also mount the image in order to do something like a test restore or to do an actual file and folder restore. I can also go ahead and restore an entire volume. So that's if I want to restore, say, an entire partition right off the bat and not just recover specific files or folders. And I can also perform a manual verification task. So that'll use the MD5 hash file that's generated alongside each backup image and actually validate it manually over and above Image Manager. This is also how you would leverage the virtual boot functionality in order to start up a machine inside either VirtualBox or Hyper-V. So there's basically two virtual boot options currently available, which is great because previously they only supported VirtualBox, and Hyper-V has actually been a recent addition. So yeah, you can basically use two different virtualization platforms in order to use virtual boot. Next, I want to show you the Image Manager software, right? So this is effectively a couple of machines that I'm currently backing up, and I've got these machines that are added, and I'm obviously looking or monitoring the folder where those backup images are stored for each machine. I can also see how big each folder currently is. I can also see how much free space is available on the drive in question, how many image files there are in the image chain, and a couple of other things. So to highlight, in terms of the verification, currently I'm verifying all newly created images automatically, and I'm basically re-verifying them once every 7 days. Now, it's important to note with the backup policies, as well as the verification tasks, as well as the replication, you can throttle those jobs. And it's either to limit the resource utilization for that task, or in the case of the replication, you can, for example, limit the maximum amount of bandwidth that it's allowed to use for that replication. So if I go to a machine that I've got the replication configured for, we've got this one over here. So I've basically got this machine, and it's basically replicating it to a shadow stream server that I've got running on the local network. Obviously, in the case of a production environment where you are the MSP and you're hosting this externally, that would probably be some type of fully qualified domain name that's used to access this resource. And in terms of the replication task, if I then show you very quickly, obviously it's pointing it to a particular directory. This is where I can throttle the amount of bandwidth that it's going to use. And I can also optionally not replicate the base images. So what that basically means is, obviously, when you first start a backup policy and you set it up as, say, a continuous incremental backup policy, what will happen is your base image is obviously the first full large backup, and it might not be ideal, especially if the client has limited internet connectivity, to replicate a very large backup image. So by ticking this option, it basically puts the onus on you to take the initial full backup image and manually get it to the replication destination. So an example of that would be to say go on site with, say, a physical external drive of sorts, taking the initial full image and then going over to your data center and then seeding that image manually. And the main purpose of that is obviously to ensure that you don't bog down the internet connection for an indeterminate amount of time to initially replicate the very large backup images. You can also optionally compress and encrypt the data stream, but that's only useful if you have not yet used that on the actual backup policy. And then it's also possible to actually replicate effectively in a bit of a daisy chain configuration. So you can have multiple instances of Image Manager basically replicating to another instance of Image Manager and another one down the chain. So you can have, say, replication in more than one location. So you're not only taking, making sure that your customer's data is not only stored on site with them, but it's also not stored in just one place with you. So that obviously ensures that there's always going to be a copy of the necessary backup images somewhere in the event of a disaster. Then, of course, you can also set up the Head Start Restore, which I've done for our domain controller. What I'm basically doing here is I'm sending these images to a VMDK file. So that's obviously for VMware virtualization infrastructure. And what that will then do is if something happens to my domain controller, I can basically just come in here, tick the little green tick in order to finalize this image, and then I can take that VMDK file, attach it to a virtual machine, obviously ensuring that I've injected any drivers during the process if I've done so, and I can actually start that machine up on VMware virtual infrastructure right off the bat. So it means that you can get a, say, production critical machine back up and running in as little time as possible. And that's the entire point of selling a disaster recovery solution as opposed to selling a backup solution. A backup solution simply makes sure that you've got another copy of your data, whereas a DR solution ensures complete business continuity and means that you spend as little time as possible getting back up and running. And obviously, in doing so, means that you lose less money because obviously the longer you are offline or the longer a critical system is offline, the more money you are potentially losing. The other tasks of Image Manager includes consolidation and retention. So consolidation means consolidation basically means taking your backup images that are generated every day and consolidating them into, say, consolidated daily images and dailies into weeklies and so on. And the idea there is that you shorten the image chain. So obviously at the moment I've got many images for this particular machine. I've got 178 backup images that I can reference. But let's say something happened a week ago, right? And I want to go to those backup images. I don't necessarily need to drill down into a particular time on that day, because if I'm running it, say, once every 15 minutes, I'm typically sitting with over 40 incremental images for that one day. So obviously by simply going to a consolidated daily image, I'm ensured that I've got all of the data in place for that particular day, rather than having to manage a lengthy image chain in order to pinpoint a particular point in time. Next, of course, as I mentioned, there's a couple of replication options, which I mentioned in the earlier slides. There's the local drive option, which is always free. And you can basically set that to, say, a local physically attached drive. And that's how you would set up a solution whereby you maybe go on site, say, once a week or whatever the case may be, and you take that physical drive off-site on behalf of your customer. And that's obviously applicable if they either don't want to pay for the licenses required by some of the WAN replication options, or simply because they are maybe in a remote location and the connectivity in that area isn't sufficient or capable of being used for ongoing replication of an entire organization's data. Then there's also network drive options, so that's basically to replicate to another network attached storage of sorts on the same network. There's also the IFTP, which I mentioned earlier. There's also shadow stream. You can disregard the legacy options because they will fall away at some point soon. And then there's also the StorageCraft Cloud, which we can't offer just yet. They're basically busy, StorageCraft Global's busy deploying additional storage infrastructure around the world, focusing in certain areas in Europe at the moment, and we're hoping that that might become available to African territories soon. The main reason why you can't use that isn't necessarily because they simply haven't made it available. It's purely because it wouldn't be feasible. Obviously, the idea of providing a cloud replication destination is it means that you've got somewhere on the internet, not necessarily something that you control like IFTP or shadow stream, where you've got a replicated copy of your data that is basically easily accessible. So what would happen in the scenario of something going horribly wrong, if you're using the StorageCraft Cloud and you're currently based in a place like the States where they have it available, is they would then ship you a drive. So you can basically get a drive with your data shipped to you. Usually you can do some type of priority shipping because it's obviously close by or in the same country, whereas obviously if it needs to get over the border, there are obviously certain circumstances where that might take some time to get to you. And obviously the longer you're offline, the more money you're losing, which is obviously why it's not feasible until they make it available in your country, because they will have local data centers, and that's the whole point. Next, what I want to show you is the central management console. So let me just switch to that quickly. So this is Shadow Control. As I mentioned, it's a web-based interface. I can actually highlight to everyone that there's a few things that I haven't seen in here, mainly because there was an update that was released within the last day or two. So I actually deployed that before launching the webinar earlier today. And there's a few bits of interesting new functionality that has actually been put in place, which is very, very useful. The first of which is status. This is a brand new feature where it actually shows you whether or not there are either shadow control or shadow protect updates available for a particular endpoint. So an important thing to note is when you want to use shadow control, you actually need to deploy 2 agents on every machine. The one would be the Shadow Protect backup agent. The other is the Shadow Control agent, so that the endpoint can subscribe to this system. And then, of course, if you're using Image Manager anywhere, then obviously that would be another agent that you would install on a particular machine, and I'll actually show you what that looks like. Next, of course, you can see a status of the overall status of the organizations. At the moment, I'm filtering all organizations. If you had multiple customers set up, you can drill down into their environment specifically in order to see unique details to that customer. You can also see any ongoing issues. So there's one machine that's affected by a backup failure, and there's another machine that's affected by a service that is currently unresponsive. And then there's also a log of past issues that have occurred that aren't necessarily current, but have occurred. These are the current issues that would come up under the status notification section. Next, if I quickly show you what the endpoints would look like. So I've got a whole range of endpoints added to our environment. These machines are currently offline, and they have been offline for some time, which is why they are marked as unknown. You can also see the agents that have updates available. So this is to indicate the SPX backup agent running on each machine, which has updates available. So I can see that there's actually a new version of SPX available right now, 6.1.0. And that'll allow us to update all of these agents to ensure that they're on the current running version. What I basically want to show you here is if I go to the same server that I had the Shadow Protect console open before, this would be this one over here, and you can see much of the same information. You can obviously see the backup policy, you can see where it's backing up to, you can see the last status and whether or not it was successful, you can see the destinations that are available, and you can obviously see a few critical things. So this server actually is a web server that runs IIS and SQL. So that's obviously great in order to ensure that you have an idea of what critical services are running in each environment. Next, I can also tag machines. So you'll notice that I've tagged this with infrastructure server and Windows. So it basically comes back to the endpoint section, right? So if I've got, say, many customers enrolled into the system, obviously if there's, say, thousands of endpoints subscribed, aside from just drilling down into a particular organization from the dashboard, for example, it might be far more useful to tag them with logical values such as servers or Windows or infrastructure, so that you can easily search over here for any of the tags that you use in order to find all of the machines that are maybe servers and find all of the machines that are running Windows in order to cater for those with a particular policy or to review their status as a result of a new policy that has been implemented or something like that. So it basically just means that you can manage a large environment far more easily. You can also see the license key that's currently assigned. In the event of a machine that does not have a license assigned at the moment, there will actually be an activate button that you can use to provide the license key, and you can actually activate the agents remotely. Next, what I want to quickly show you is the backup policy. So I can quickly go through creating a new backup policy. You would basically give it a name, let's say client A workstations. You can give it a path which has to be local to that environment, so it obviously has to be at client A's network, at client B, and so on. You provided some details. I'm actually just going to fill in some dummy details over here. Once you've got that backup policy added, or backup store added, sorry, then you add the backup policy. So the backup policy is where you come in, and I'll also say call it client A, workstations, and this is where you can configure what you want to back up. So there's a couple of schemes available. There's either all volumes, which is basically all partitions and drives, or only OS or operating system volumes, or only data volumes. So it basically means that you've got an easy way of generating backup policies. You can then send those backup images to a particular backup store. You can apply a particular level of compression. An important thing to note here is that standard compression typically saves you about 40% in terms of data or storage utilization, whereas the high or best compression method can typically save you about 50%. But it's important to note that compression is obviously a CPU-intensive task, and as a result, you may need to use this at your discretion, because it might not be the best idea on a server that is always very busy in terms of CPU utilization, because it might bog down the server. You can also obviously apply the levels of encryption. So I see one of the updates that they released is they've actually stripped out RC4 encryption. I actually see this now for the first time. So they've obviously stripped out the least secure of the encryption methods that they had available, which is obviously great, because it now means that you have far more secure options available. Next, you can define the backup schedule, and there's a couple of options available. First of which, and this is generally the default, is the continuous incremental backup image schedule, where it creates, as they say, a full backup as the base image, and then performs incremental backups from that point forward to account for any changes that have occurred. And I can basically assign that over particular days. I can set a specific time frame, and I can also set things like the repeat value. So this is where you define your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective, because you need to determine how far are you comfortable sitting without data. How often do you need to run that backup schedule? How important is that data to you? Do you only want to do it once, say, every 12 hours, or once an hour, or once every 15 minutes for a critical system? There's a couple of other options available. The mixed basically mixes a full backup schedule with an incremental. It basically means that you can have many full backup images so that you don't have to rely on an extremely lengthy image chain. And then there's also a full schedule backup, so that's for machines where you only want to perform full backups and an incremental might not be necessary. And then maybe on an ad hoc basis, if you intend on running some updates, or if you intend on deploying some new code or new software, it might be worthwhile to, as an ad hoc procedure, run a full backup in the manual sense that you can then assign to machines and then run. Then on the advanced option, obviously I mentioned earlier with Image Manager that you can throttle things like the verification and the bandwidth usage for the replication. You can also throttle the resource utilization of the actual backup policies. You can also do things like auto-executing missed backups, which is great if a machine wasn't on the network. So maybe someone's left with their laptop, they come back to the office, and now it'll continue to back up and account for all of the data that has not been backed up during the time that they were away. You can also do things like splitting your backup images into smaller files. So this is useful if you need to consolidate your backup images onto some type of fixed length media like CDs, DVDs, or Blu-rays, or whatever the case may be. And then there's also various scripting options. So you can do things that would typically not be part of the backup policy, but that might be necessary. So maybe you've got an old legacy application where you've got, say, a finicky database server. An easy example that I generally have here is something like old Pastel server, for example, where I know that all the servers had a notorious issue where the database server would lock the files and you wouldn't be able to do a successful VSS backup of those files. So what you could do as, say, a pre-snapshot script is temporarily stop the database server and post-snapshot restart that database server as an easy example. And maybe if you finish the job, maybe you've been sending the data to a local destination, and as a finished job script, you actually want to immediately copy it over the network to another location. Those are obviously easy examples of what you could use the scripting functionality for, but you can obviously use your imagination. Maybe there's something specific that you want to do. There's also the ability to do various forms of push installs. And the last thing that I want to show you here is if you want to assign a backup policy to a particular machine, I can go into a particular section. All I need to do is tick the endpoints that I want to apply this policy to. I can either apply it immediately or at a random time following this. And as soon as I click review and then save, it'll actually apply the policy to those machines. And the reason that I can't apply it to these is because these already have policies in place and therefore conflict. You can also, as I mentioned, do push installs. So that is only applicable to either managed endpoints or if you're using Microsoft's System Operations Center, or if you're using VMware's vCenter, where you can basically push the agent onto the virtualized infrastructure, for example. And there's also a license pool. So this is only perpetual keys. So unfortunately, you can't use this for MSP product keys, but it's basically great where you can add, say, a pool of keys that you have purchased for your organization, and you can basically move those around, because the important thing to note with a perpetual key is it can be recycled. So if you've stopped using it on one machine, you can actually remove it and activate it on a new machine, whereas you cannot do that with MSP keys. If you need to replace a machine or replace a license, you delete that key or basically remove it from your billing, and then a new key is added for the new machine. Next, there's a few things that I want to cover from the application settings perspective. Obviously, there's a few things such as time zone, resource utilization. I can also take a backup in order to maybe move it to a new shadow control instance, maybe on new hardware or whatever the case may be. I can also configure the network interface. I can also configure security options, which is the SSL certificate. I can also set up the mail server so the system can send out notifications. And I can also change branding. So I've obviously got our ESET logo in here, and I'll show you what one of those reports would look like in a moment. There's also the ITSM notification, so this can go maybe to your support email address for your organization. You can also see the instructions for installing the shadow control agent specifically, and then the product registration is just the admin details for the environment. Next, there's obviously many user accounts that you can configure. You can also set up many user roles, so different levels of permissions. You can also set up status rules. This is another item that has changed. It was previously called, I believe it was Shadow Protect policies, and these are basically the status alerts that you want to set up. So if I quickly edit the default policy, it's whether or not the shadow control agent has become unresponsive, or if backups have been failing, or if someone maybe paused a backup and forgot to resume it, or if licenses are due to expire, or if the service here has become unresponsive, and then the same for Image Manager. Also whether or not there's sufficient disk space, or if verification is failing, or if consolidation is failing, or if replication is failing, and everything else. So it basically means that regardless of what you have in place for a customer, you can cater the status alerts around the SLA that you have with that customer. So you can say, okay, we can monitor and alert around everything ranging from disk space to whether or not someone on your admin side maybe paused something, and you can obviously bill them for that because you're providing DR as a service. Next, you can also set up multiple organizations, like I mentioned. So I've got default and I've got our ESET Africa over here. If I was to add a new organization, I can give it a name. I can apply a default backup policy so that you can ensure that any machines that are added to this organization immediately has a predefined policy applied to them. And you can also fill in contact information to send reports and alerts. So that can obviously be, say, the CEO or the IT department or something like that, so that they can see what's going on. Next, you can obviously set up all the tagging, and then lastly, the last thing that I need to show you is the report. So I'm just going to run the full super admin report very quickly. And as you can see, there's the rebranding at play. You see the logo, you see the company name, you see the status for the entire environment, you see a storage forecast. Now, this is a very useful feature. Basically, what this does, and it's important to note that it becomes more accurate the longer you run your backup jobs, because the more data it has backed up, the more accurate the calculation is to determine how much storage you will require in, say, a 12-month period. So just to give you an idea of how quickly this changes, we did a couple of Partner Connect events some time ago, and it was basically a 2-week time frame, where initially it was estimating a ridiculous close to 5, it was actually, no, sorry, it was about 2 or 3 petabytes of storage that it would require, whereas a week or 2 later, it had dropped to a couple of terabytes, and then obviously now running for a very long time, we've actually got it down to something along the lines of 240 gigs, despite the fact that previously, with the figures that I've noted, that was basically backing up about 3 or 4 machines, where I'm currently backing up far more than that. So it gives you an idea of how quickly that number changes the longer you run it and how more accurate the forecast becomes. So that pretty much wraps up the presentation and the webinar. I'm just going to have a quick look to see if I've received any questions, and I'll work towards answering those. So I've just stopped sharing my screen so that I can get to that section. I've got a question here from memory asking if we can send you this presentation. What I've actually done is I've actually recorded this whole webinar. I just need to review the recording, and we can actually make that available on our wiki, and you can actually view it online. We can also send you the actual presentation. That's certainly not a problem. So I'll make a note of that, and we can get that to you. Are there any other questions? Hello? Hello? Okay, so I've got two questions here. The one is a job a single event? Please explain how jobs work. So basically, a job is assigned to a particular machine. So if I take a step back and I just open up the one screen that I had before, what you've got here is I've got my domain controller, and I've got a head start restore job. So that will use one head start restore job license. If I then delete this job, I will free up that license and make it available to apply to a new machine. And the same applies for replication. So basically, one job license is associated with one particular machine at any point in time. I've got another question that says, just need to find out if it's compatible with the VM environment. Can you maybe clarify which hypervisor you're referring to? Or maybe just clarify that question. The backup agent itself can go on any virtual machine, regardless of the hypervisor in use. So if you're using, say, Hyper-V or VMware or Zen or KVM, it doesn't matter. You can always install the backup agent on the operating system in question. With regards to shadow control is deployed as a virtual machine template. And basically what that means is you can either deploy the VM template or you get an ISO so that you can actually simply attach that ISO to a particular machine and then obviously boot it up and then start the installation of the shadow control process. Apologies for the noise in the background. We've got a bit of a loud office at the moment. We are wrapping up, so I'm hoping that's not too much of a distraction for people. To memory, yes, there are demo licenses available. It's basically available on request. The NFR licenses that we have are valid for 90 days, so it gives you sufficient time to trial the product. It basically includes one server license, 3 desktop or workstation licenses, as well as a 333 license for image manager. And the 333 basically implies that you could have up to 3, say, IFTP replication jobs or 3 shadow stream jobs, as well as 3 head start restore jobs. So if you'd like to get that, please get in touch with sales and we can supply you that. And then just another thing around that, there are also short trials available straight off the StorageCraft website. So it basically, those are only applicable to the Shadow Protect backup agent, and they're only available for 15 days, whereas the NFR trials that we provide, as I mentioned, are valid for 90 days. Next, I just want to see if I'm missing any questions. Will you need a license for replication and head start restore jobs if replication destination is an attached drive? So as I mentioned, local replication is always free. Head start restore and network replication typically require licenses. So I hope that answers that question. And I'm just trying to see if I've missed anything else. It doesn't look like it. I'm going to give a couple of seconds longer for anyone to send through any last questions before we wrap this up. Okay, so it doesn't seem like I'm getting any further questions, so I hope this was a very informative session for the participants. Thank you very much for joining. As I mentioned, we will, hopefully, if the quality of this recording is okay, we will be making this webinar available on our wiki, and then we will also be able to share the presentation for those that need it. And obviously, please get in touch with our sales if you need pricing or trials or anything else. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.